pancake, everyone. The death penalty is the most severe punishment that there is, right? Is it a good thing or a bad thing? Do we need it or do we not? Is it humane or inhumane to take a person's life? Who can make the call? What is the price of a mistake? How much does an execution cost? What about keeping someone in jail for life? Who are the executioners and where do they come from? And who are these lovely fellows in real life? How did our ancestors go about it? And what is arquebusing? And what countries can you return from missing your head? In today's episode, we'll be covering this and much more. Let's get started. Let's go over the history. The death penalty has been used longer than anybody can even remember. Our ancestors treated this event simply, did it publicly, and the remains were put on public display so that others would be afraid. Criminals were subject to relentless torture, and their moans could be heard echoing throughout the area. People came to the executions as if it were a spectacle, and the executioners were revered and respected. Criminals were mostly hanged, but there were also more sophisticated ways to separate the soul from the body. For example, crucifixion was used universally. The poor subject of such execution usually died on the second or third day from thirst and loss of blood, while being on the verge of going into shock. The European Inquisition preferred to burn people at the stake. Thousands of sorcerers, witches, heretics, and other people who didn't look like your typical medieval European were burned in the squares. Exceptionally beautiful girls were also burned. Burned for scientific discoveries, for dissent, and of course for crimes. If there were problems with fuel, the ancestors of modern Europeans practiced drowning. For example, witches were tested using water. They were tied up and thrown into the water. If a girl drowned, she was considered innocent in hindsight, but if she didn't, then she'd be subject to hanging. So not a lot of options, as you can see. Maybe that's where the phrase "lucky as a man who drowned" comes from. In Russia, for the sake of fun, they could sew up a convict in a bearskin and hunt him down with dogs, though there was also a more humane method, where they were put onto a barrel of gunpowder and sent to their forefathers. People had pieces of meat cut out from their bodies, they were skinned, and they were boiled in boiling liquid. They were buried alive in the ground up to their necks. The prisoner usually died on the second or third day from dehydration and starvation, while being totally helpless. The ancient Egyptians preferred to beat people to death with sticks, with this method typically being used for crimes against the pharaohs, who loved themselves very much. In ancient Greece, a noble person could be allowed to take poison and not be tormented in a shameful beating. Meanwhile, everybody else would often be thrown off a cliff. In a lot of countries, quartering was used mainly to punish for treason and rebellion. First, the perpetrator would have his arms cut off, then his legs, and finally his head. The ancient Chinese loved to snitch, and failing to report something that you should have might result in your body getting cut in half. In Russia, a vicious bandit could get his body torn in half. His arms would be tied to the top of one bent-over tree, and his legs to the top of another one. Then the tops were released, the trees would straighten out, and they could have also used horses that would run in opposite directions, with a fairly obvious outcome. Counterfeiters were given a shot of molten metal down their throats. Villains were impaled, and their agony lasted for several days. They were hung up on hooks, fed to rats, dissolved in acid, subjected to extreme cold, or to one of another 101 savage methods for sending the soul to hell, or heaven. It's terrifying, isn't it? But what's the current situation? How much progress have we made? Nowadays, simpler methods of capital punishment are used. Legislators strive to make the flight to infinity as painless and quick as possible, if that is possible at all. There are 7 basic ways of modern mortification. Do you know what they are? First, there's hanging, the most shameful and disgraceful thing. When the convict is hanged using a rope, either the spinal cord sustains damage or suffocation occurs due to compression of the trachea. Then there's execution by gunshot. In ancient times, they preferred to use arquebuses. Either one person shoots, death in this case occurs quickly, but they can also employ an entire squad of shooters. In that case, you are less likely to die quickly and painlessly. They shoot from a distance, their accuracy is lower, and not all shooters strive for accuracy. Then there's beheading. A total of 7 countries consider this to be an option, but only one country actually practices it. Either a guillotine or a sharp sword is used. Do you have any idea what country this might be? No. Well, we're about to get to it. The next method of execution is throwing stones. This method is used unofficially in certain Arab countries, and it is a painful way to be executed. A person is able to endure massive blows for a long time while remaining conscious. Then there's the electric chair, where a high-voltage current is applied to the head and limbs of the executed person through wet electrodes. This results in heart failure and a person's breathing being paralyzed. A really painful death. Gas poisoning. When a gas chamber is filled with toxic cyanide or carbon dioxide, death occurs as a result of suffocation. And finally, we have lethal injection, when substances that cause unconsciousness, respiratory arrest, or heart spasm are introduced into the circulatory system. Who are the executioners? Which country is the most likely to pass a terrible sentence? And how do you avoid a premature death? We will be discussing this and much more later in the video. So does the world seek to abolish the death penalty, or does it not? In the modern world, the goal of the death penalty is to take the life of a criminal in order to put a stop to his atrocities, while causing as little suffering as possible. But it doesn't always work out that way. We're about to find out why it is so. What do you think? Doesn't the very expectation of execution cause suffering to the convicted person? After all, the waiting time for execution of a sentence can sometimes be several years. How do you think a person is going to feel waiting to meet their fate? Just imagine the state of a prisoner who is being told that his pardon has been rejected and his sentence will be carried out. And in some countries, the convicted person is not informed of the date of execution at all. But then you reap what you sow, isn't that right? As long as the court didn't make a mistake. Executioner University, where do they learn? There is an understaffing issue. Where do you get hangmen? And who would even agree to do this? As a matter of fact, few people are capable of wetting prisoners on a regular basis without emotion, no matter who they are. Aside from professional executioners who inherited their craft, heirs who nobody asked, other prisoners, guards, soldiers, policemen, and even priests had to deal with this bloody business, and many of them had to force themselves to do this job. Some would carefully study the verdict. They told themselves that they were going to execute a non-human that didn't deserve to live. Others tried to remove themselves from everything that was happening. They quickly got the job done and tried to forget about it as soon as they could. Others still, after prolonged nightmares, got over it and no longer felt any remorse. But do you know what they were all sure of? It is better to spare 100 guilty people than to allow a single innocent person to lose his life. So does society generally approve the death penalty? More likely yes than no. Who is more in favor? It is mainly supported by men, high earners, as well as residents of rural areas. Surprisingly, with an increase in the age of respondents, the number of supporters of the death penalty decreases markedly. The death penalty is mostly opposed by people with a high level of education. What about the cost? You'd think it would be cheaper to just put somebody to sleep, but Americans and Canadians are not quite sure. The death penalty in these countries sometimes costs the budget 2 to 3 times more than a life sentence. As surprising as that might sound, but it's a fact. First of all, it takes longer to review the case, then there's the lengthy appeal process. Also, time is taken away from other cases, aside from other factors. Top countries in the world where being a criminal can be deadly. China. What are people traditionally executed for? For corruption, of course. If you accepted a bribe in excess of $460,000, Chinese executioners will give you a privileged lethal injection. Drug dealers and murderers are simply shot, and their families are charged for the bullets. The verdict will be read out publicly, but they will be executed quietly. The Chinese send up to several thousand criminals a year to the other world. Some people think that it is better to replace the death penalty with life imprisonment, but is this really humane? Do you know what prisoners say when there's such a court ruling? We will be discussing this and much more further in the video. Iran. In Iran, you can go through the White Tunnel ahead of schedule for obtaining illegal information, especially in favor of the CIA, as well as murder, drug trafficking, rape, armed robbery, blasphemy, sodomy, prostitution, alcoholism, and cheating on your spouse. It's also worth noting that for false accusations of sexual crimes, you can die before the due date. Cowards and traitors are also not welcome in Iran. Mostly death is administered by hanging, but sometimes to make the victim suffer, they use a tilted crane that promises a long approach towards death. The agony continues for a long time. A person may also be stoned to death, but not necessarily. The practice of pardoning death row inmates, or playing with death? Twin brother. Once upon a time, Lazarus Colorado had a parasitic twin named Johann Baptista. The parasite was sticking right out of Lazarus's chest. It had one head, one leg, and 2 arms. The twin's eyes and mouth were always open, and saliva was constantly oozing out of his mouth. He did not speak and was not aware of himself in the world at all, only occasionally shuddering and sighing sadly. One day the host brother got drunk on brave water and killed a man in a drunken brawl. He was sentenced to be hanged. At the trial, Lazarus exposed his body and showed his parasitic brother, who was obviously not guilty of murder, but would have suffered with him on the gallows anyway. The court spared him, but Lazarus was released. Saudi Arabia. Drug dealers, murderers, and for good measure, unwanted political opponents can be decapitated, beheaded using an Arab saber, quickly, professionally, and efficiently. Rumor has it they also practice stoning, shooting, and crucifixion of a decapitated body. Most executions take place during mass gatherings in the central square. State executioner is a hereditary position. It is inherited and considered very honorable. What do you think? If you put a feisty viper in a jar, will it turn into a humble snake in 25 years? Iraq. Most death sentences are carried out against terrorists. Method of choice, hanging, through which the former national leader Saddam Hussein was also sent to Allah not too long ago. Vietnam. The Criminal Code of Vietnam has as many as 35 articles according to which you can go to the other world for your crimes. State security, civil, and, oddly enough, democratic freedoms should not be jeopardized, nor should marriage and family, property, life, and honor be violated. It is mortally dangerous to violate laws that protect the environment and public order. Method of choice, injecting poison. Want some advice? Don't be naughty in Vietnam. The practice of pardoning death row inmates or playing with death. Life-giving chess. Osip Bernstein was a phenomenal chess player, and was widely renowned. During the revolution he tried to escape from the Bolsheviks, was caught and sentenced to death by firing squad. Fortunately for him, a chess-playing officer led the execution. Having recognized the prisoner to be the Grandmaster, he offered him to square off in a chess match. The reward was his freedom. Bernstein won the most important game of his life, and was released. Hey, these things happen. Belarus. Women are completely exempt from the death penalty, but men are not so lucky. For committing a particularly severe crime, such as the deliberate murder of minors, genocide, instigating a war or a terrorist attack, a person might have to pay with his life. The United States of America. What is the situation in the most democratic country in the world? Do they also have everything? Or not everything? Let's set the record straight. The most common method of elimination is a lethal injection, though as of recently there have been many issues with it. Namely, suppliers rebel, poison is not delivered to you in the right quantities, and you have to turn on the electric chair, or resort to deadly gas, hanging, and shooting. These methods of justice are used only in a few states, for example Texas, and are now extremely rare. The American system can postpone a sentence for quite a long time. Many prisoners languish in their cell for decades waiting for the day when their sentence will be carried out. It's also worth noting that the noble Americans observe the rule of the Last Supper and the last word before the moment of truth, as demanded by democracy. The practice of pardoning death row inmates or playing with death. The Savior Beetle. Deacon Latreille nearly had his head severed during the French Revolution. The priest was imprisoned in a dungeon and waited for the resolution of his fate, while carefully studying the local bugs. The prison doctor once found Latreille enthusiastically examining a beetle in his palm. The curious doctor asked, "What is so interesting about this insect?" "This is not a bug," the prisoner exclaimed, "but a rare insect called Necrobia rufficulus." The doctor was shocked by the priest's knowledge of insects. He took him to a naturalist friend of his, and it turned out that the deacon was absolutely correct. Being that he was such an important person to French science, Latreille was released. Having survived, he hastily retrained to become an entomologist. North Korea. Hanging and shooting are normal here, but you can also use pretty much any other method. From time to time, superiors can take more creative approaches. Rumor has it that some chairmen were executed with flamethrowers, mortar shells, and even anti-aircraft guns. You can actually be subject to capital punishment for petty theft or prostitution. Oh, and you can't watch South Korean media, so be careful with the remote control. Japan. A very wayward country. Traditional Western ideas don't work here. One of the most developed countries in the world, Japan firmly hangs on to its right to carry out the death penalty. Society widely supports such punishments for the irredeemable. The line to the gallows stretches for many years, and the executioners carry out only a few sentences a year. The practice of pardoning death row inmates or playing with death, the man who couldn't be hanged. In 1803, 3 criminals were executed in the suburbs of Sydney in front of a large crowd. They were caught committing a robbery. One of the 3 thieves, Joseph Samuel, is considered to be the only person to survive 3 unsuccessful hangings. Sounds unbelievable, doesn't it? Samuel's accomplices, while on their way to purgatory, watched as the rope of their colleague broke 3 times. After the second failure, the people began to demand to release the lucky dude, but the executioner did not let up. On the 3rd attempt, the hanged man's feet were touching the ground. The executioner, worried that he might have incorrectly calculated the length of the rope, started asking, "What is this? Divine intervention?" The people began to demand the immediate release of the criminal, who can even survive 3 hangings. Definitely not somebody who's guilty. When the mayor arrived, he carefully inspected the gallows, the rope, and interrogated the executioner. And taking this as a sign from above, he ordered Samuel to be released. So is the death penalty the harshest possible punishment? Is there a need for it or not? Is it humane or inhumane to take a person's life? I reckon this argument has been going on ever since they started using it. Every inhabitant of our round planet, including you, has an opinion on the matter, isn't that right? I personally like the following words once uttered by a wise man. And if I am not an ardent opponent of the death penalty now, then at least I am not an ardent supporter. I guess we'll leave it to you to draw your own personal thoughts on the topic. And that'll be all for today. Thank you very much for watching. Please like, share, comment, and subscribe. And make sure to keep yourself and your loved ones safe. Good luck. See you soon.